So today's daf is daf Lamed Aleph. And the Gemara says the following. Kevan de kamatrich chalitza made the yada de chumra bi'almahu. The Gemara was worried about a chashash, a possible suspicion that those who are watching what's going on and they see that there's no yibum, they're going to assume that the Kiddushin of the Erva, Rivka is the Erva, she's a relative to Ruvain, they're going to assume that that's Vadai Kiddushin, which is not true at all. It was a Safek Kiddushin because he put the Kesef Safek Karav Lo, Safek Karav Lo. But they'll mistakenly, if we require Chalitza to this Sarah, and that's Sarah, who's the Tzara of Rivka, Rivka is the Erva, then they're going to have to understand that the Kiddushin of the Erva, again, that's Rivka, is not valid Kiddushin. And they'll understand once we require Chalitza that the Tzara is not Misya Bemes, there's no possibility of Yibum, and that's only a Chumra Bi'alma. In other words, we really should rely on a Chazaka that Ruvain's marriage to Rivka was not a valid marriage. And that is to maintain Sarah's Chazaka, because status quo, Sarah is not a Tzaras Erva, and therefore she should fall for Yibum. But we're not going to be choshesh that people, when they see that Rabbanan suspended Yibum and they blocked Yibum, that they're going to come to the conclusion that the marriage of Shimon to Rivka was a Vadai Kiddushin. No, they'll understand, since we require Chalitza, that it's really just a Chumra Bi'alma, that really the Kiddushin of Shimon to Rivka was not a valid Kiddushin. Sarah, therefore, is not a Tzaras Erva. With the death of Shimon, Sarah falls for Yibum to Ruvain, and Ruvain, Me'ikra Din, should be Meyabim her because Sarah's not a Tzaras Erva, because the marriage to Rivka, the Erva, was not a valid marriage. And they'll understand that the very fact that that there's no Yibum is only a Chumra Bi'alma, because according to the strict letter of the law, they'll understand that there should be Yibum, and the Kiddushin of Shimon to Rivka was not a valid Kiddushin. So the Gemara asks the Hachi, if you're going to tell me, then in the case of Safek Kiddushin, we don't know whether Shimon's Kiddushin, his Maisa Kiddushin with Rivka, was a valid Maisa Kiddushin. And at this point in time, Sarah, the wife of Shimon, has a Chezkes Heter Liyibum, and we're going to say that Misafek, we're going to be Machmir, and we're going to suspend Yibum, and we're not afraid that people are going to come to the conclusion that Sarah does not fall for Yibum. They'll see that Sarah requires Chalitza, so they'll understand that the reason why there's no Yibum in this case, where Reuven cannot be Miyabim Sarah, it's only a Chumra Bi'alma. If that be the case, says the Gemara, Gerishin Nami, Lisnei, the Litzrach Chalitza. We go back to our original question about the case of Gerishin, which means that Shimon was married to both Rivka, who is a relative of Reuven's, and Sarah. He gave a get, which was a Safek get to Rivka, which would mean that if that get was valid, then with the death of Shimon, Sarah would fall for Yibum to Reuven, and she's not a Tsaras Erva because at the time of Shimon's death, Rivka, the Erva, was not married to Shimon because Shimon had delivered her a get. But now we have a case of Safek Gerushin. And in the case of Safek Gerushin, we had the opinion of Rabbah on Daf Lamed Amid Beis, according to which it cannot be a case of Safek Karav Lo, Safek Karav Law, where Shimon threw a get towards Rivka with the intention of divorcing Rivka, but we're not sure whether or not it came within the domain of Rivka. So that makes it into a Safek Gerushin. And according to Rabbah, in this case of Safek Karav Lo, Safek Karav Law, the halacha would be, as far as Sarah is concerned, that she doesn't need even chalitza. We're going to let her get married without even requiring chalitza. And the reason for that is because her status quo was that of a tzaras erva, because Shimon was married to both Rivka the erva and Sarah. And now you want to say, well, maybe the get was a valid get. No, we're going to say, Ukmi Gavra Cheskasei, she had a Cheskas Muteris Lashuk as a Tzaras Erva. So the Gemara asks, wait a second, Litzracha Chalitza. In this case of Safek, we should require Chalitza, because again, the principle is that in a case of Safek, we require Chalitza. For example, we had the case of Safek Kedushin, where we weren't sure whether or not Shimon was Makadesh Rivka. And in that case, Sarah, after the death of Shimon, when she falls for Yibum to Reuven, we said that she needs Chalitza Lechumra. And when I say Chalitza Lechumra, what I mean to say is that in the case of Safek Kedushin, she had a Cheskas Heter Liyibum, because we have no reason to suspect that she is a Tzaras Erva. So she falls for Yibum to Reuven with the death of Shimon, and Reuven should be able to be Miyamima. We were machmir to say, no, we're not going to allow Yibum. And why aren't we going to allow Yibum? Because perhaps the Kedushin was a valid Kedushin. And we're going to change her chazaka from a cheskes heter liyibum, and we're going to be machmir and say that she doesn't get yibum. Obviously, she needs chalitza. And likewise, the Gemara, by analogy, is saying in a Safek Gerushin situation, we should not be choshesh that if the onlooker sees that Sarah, the Tzara, gets chalitza, they can assume that the Gerushin in which Shimon divorced Rivka was a Vadei Gerushin, and therefore Sarah is not a Tzaras Erva, and that's why we require chalitza. So why not, even in that case, require chalitza and what is her status now? Let's go over this one more time. Her status, I'm talking about her, meaning Sarah, when she falls for Yibum to Reuven. Her status is that of a Tzaras Erva, which would mean that she's Muteris L'Shuk. So she has a Cheskas Heter L'Shuk. And the Gemara is arguing now, right? She has a Cheskas Tzaras Erva and a Cheskas Het, therefore a Cheskas Heter L'Shuk. So the Gemara is arguing now, since we do have a suffix, we don't know whether the get that Shimon delivered to Rivka was a valid get or not. We have to be machmir on the tzad that what? That the get was, one second, that the get was a valid get. And if we're machmir that the get was a valid get, that means that Sarah falls for Yibum. She's not at Sarah's Erva. So even though before the get she had a Chezkas Heter L'Shuk, now we have to be worried based on the Safek Gerushin that maybe this Gerushin was valid and therefore she's no longer Sarah's Erva and therefore she requires Chalitza, Mitzad Safek. And what's your fear? Your fear is that by requiring chalitza, the onlooker might come to the mistaken conclusion that the get is a get. No, we don't have to worry about that because since she doesn't have yibum, they'll understand. Meidei Yadi, says the Gemara, de chumra bi'almahu, that the requirement of chalitza, which is based on the fact that the gerushin was chal, it was a valid get, that was just a chumrah. So they won't come to that takola that we spoke about by drawing the mistaken conclusion that the get was a valid get. And again, the discussion on the previous Amud was that if they come to the mistaken conclusion that the get was a valid get, and then he goes ahead, he marries her sister, and they might think that, well, since the get was valid, therefore there'll be matir achos l'shuk. All the discussions that we had on the previous Amud, the Gemara is saying that you could avoid all that. They're not going to assume that the gerushin is definitely a valid gerushin. They'll understand that chalitza is only a chumra bi'alma. Haraya, she doesn't fall for yibum. If the get was a valid get, she would require yibum, or there would be a possibility of yibum. So now the Gemara comes up with a hit from left field. The Gemara says, you're right. We don't have to be choshesh that people will assume a valid get just because they saw that she has chalitza. They will understand very well that the requirement of chalitza is only a chumra bi'alma. So then why is it that Rabbah insists that she doesn't get chalitza? We're not worried about the suffix at all. Because imata omer choletzes is then, I'm going to add a word here, af misya bemes. They're going to assume that if she requires chalitza, then he's allowed to be miyamima. There's a mitzvah of yibum. And he's got a mitzvah of either yibum or chalitza. And generally speaking, those two go hand in hand. If there's a possibility of yibum, then she's ru'uya chalitza, but she's also ru'uya l'yibum. So if they see that she requires chalitza, they're going to think that there's a possibility of yibum as well. And again, in this particular case, yibum is totally out of the question. Mikra adin, it's also l'siyame, because Sarah has a chezkas Sarah's erva. We don't know that Rivka, the erva, was divorced. So the Gemara is saying now that therefore we're not going to be machmir and require chalitza, because if we do so, there's going to be a michshal. There'll be matir yibum as well, because they assume that whenever there's chalitza, there's yibum. So the Gemara raises the following objection. If you're going to assume that any woman who gets chalitza, we have to worry about the possibility that they'll also require yibum, is let's go back to the case of Safek Kiddushin. Hachinami, imata omer choletzes, is misyabemes. People will mistakenly think that she could fall for yibum. Right? We said that in this case of Safek Kiddushin, and we're not sure if Shimon married Rivka. And that would make Sarah into a tsaras erva. So we say that in Safek Kiddushin, Sarah requires chalitza. Maybe they'll come to be miyamin. And since, again, we're worried about the suffix that maybe the Kiddushin is valid, which would make Sarah into a tsaras erva, and she doesn't fall for yibum, and therefore she's ashes ach. And now somebody will allow yibum because he required chalitza, gewalt. People will allow yibum in a case where she might be a tsaras erva. And the Gemara says, "Tisyabim ve'im bekach klum de'achazaka kokaima." We don't have to worry in the case of a Safek Kiddushin. Right now, her situation, the status of Sarah, is that she falls for yibum. She's a full-fledged wife to Shimon. Shimon died without children, and Sarah falls for yibum to Reuven. Maybe the Kiddushin, when Shimon was Makadesh, Rivka was a valid Kiddushin. It was Safek Karav Law, maybe it was Karav Law, and it was a valid Kiddushin. No. Then you're upsetting, you're undermining Hachazaka. Hachazaka is that she should fall for yibum until, she's innocent until proven guilty. You want to make her into a tsaras erva, the burden of proof is on you to establish bevados that she's a tsaras erva and remove hacheskes heter liyibum. So you're worried that since people will see that we require chalitza in this case for Sarah, therefore they'll think that Sarah could fall for yibum as well, and Reuven could be miyavima. Cake is a day. I don't have to worry about that. Let that happen. Because Sarah's chazaka is a cheskes heter liyibum until you establish that she's a tsaras erva by validating the Kiddushin between Shimon and Rivka. We have no reason to do so. Okay. So we're up to Esvei Abai. Abai is now going to raise an objection to Rabbah. Rabbah, Daf Lamed Omid Beis, had established that if we don't know whether or not the get that Shimon gave to Rivka was a valid get or not, in a case of Safek Karav Law, we're going to allow Sarah to get married because Hachazaka is a Cheskas Tsaras Erev. When I say get married, I mean marry Lashur. Esvei Abaye, we have a Mishnah later on at Daf Samach Zayin. Nafal Abayis Olavial Bas Ochiv Vein Yedua Ezu Me'am Beis Rishon. So the Mishnah addresses the following tragic scenario. Reuven and Shimon are brothers. Reuven has a daughter by the name of Rivka, and Shimon marries his niece, the daughter of Reuven, Rivka. He also has another wife by the name of Sarah. So now, right now, we know that the facts on the ground, Shimon is married to two wives. He's got a wife by the name of Sarah, and he's married to Reuven's to his niece, Reuven's daughter by the name of Rivka. Now, right now, Sarah has a cheskes heter lishuk. if in event that Shimon dies, because she's a Tzaras Erva. But now, Nebuch, a tragedy happened, like something that happened not long ago in Florida, and the house fell apart. It collapsed, and Shimon and Rivka died. We have no way of determining who died first. Now, if Shimon dies first, then Sarah is a Tzaras Erva, and she would be able to get married to anyone she wants to. She doesn't need Chalitza Yibum. If, on the other hand, Rivka died first, then Sarah falls for Yibum. She's not a Tzaras Erva because at the time that Shimon died after Rivka's death, she was the only wife of Shimon because Rivka had already died previously. So the Mishnah paskins Sarasa Choletzes, that Sarah requires Chalitza, meaning we're afraid that perhaps Rivka died before Shimon, and therefore at the time of the death of Shimon, Sarah is not a Tzaras Erva, she falls for Yibum. So we have to require Chalitza, but for Lo Misyabemes. Why? Because on the tzad that Shimon died first, and at that moment in time, he was married to both Rivka and Sarah. Sarah is a Tzaras Erva, so therefore she cannot have Yibum. All this, says Abaye, is against Rabbah. He says, Amai, right, why is it that Sarah is Choletzes? Why not go back to her original Chazaka? Her Chazaka was that she was a Tzaras Erva. Shimon has been married for years and years to both Rivka and Sarah. Rivka is an Erva, and Sarah has the status and the Chazaka of a Tzaras Erva. Is Hachinami Nema Ishizu B'Cheskes Et L'Shuk Omedes Uvi Safek Atabol Yosha Al Tasrena Mi Safek? How can you require Chalitza according to Rabbah? Rabbah says that if a woman is, meaning Sarah B'Cheskas Tzaras Erva, because right now Shimon is married to Rivka as well as Sarah, and Rivka is an Erva. And now you want to say, well, maybe Shimon's get that he gave to Rivka was valid. That's exactly identical with the case of the Mishnah. Maybe Rivka died before Shimon. So that we don't understand the psak, the final ruling of the Mishnah in the sugya of Nafal of Abayis Ve'Albas Achiv. Why there do we require Chalitza? She has a Chezkas Tzaras Erva, which is a Chezkas Heter L'Shuk, and therefore, according to Rabbah, she should be Muteres. And if you'll answer, Hachinami, L'Chumra, they only required Chalitza L'Chumra. Really, she should be able to get married without that. She has a Chezkas Heter L'Shuk because she has a Chezkas Tzaras Erva. We're only going to require Chalitza as a Chumra. And why is that? Because there is a possibility, 50% in fact, that Shimon died first. So Gemara asks, how can you say such a thing? It's a chumrah di asil de kulahu. This is a chumrah that is a built-in, time explosion box. Shemata omer choletzes misyabemes. So we'll say the following: that people will think that she falls for yibum. Really, she has a chezkas tzaras erva, and chas v'shalom to allow yibum. So the Gemara says that therefore we cannot allow this chumrah of requiring chalitza because it'll lead to a kula that people will assume that since you require chalitza, therefore yibum is also an option. So the Gemara now has two different answers, two different approaches to differentiate between Rabba's case of a Safek Gerushin and the Mishnah's case of Nafal Abayis, a Safek who died first. First answer. Gerushin de Shchichi Gazu Be'Rabbana. Ma Poles de lo Shchichi lo Gazu Be'Rabbana. You're right. We have to worry about a chumrah of requiring chalitza and a safek if it might lead to a takala in which they will assume that if chalitza is okay, then yibum is okay. But that chashash is only a chashash to Rabbanon, and because of that suspicion, the Rabbanon required chalitza. They'll only do that in a case that it's shchiyah, because we have an absolute rule that b'milsa lo shchicha lo gazru be'Rabbanan. So in gerushin, which is shchiyah, is gazru be'Rabbanan. So in a safek, they made a gzeira, and they said, we're not going to allow chalitza, because if we allow chalitza, then they may confuse and assume if there's chalitza, there's evil. But in the case of apoles, how frequently do we have a case of apoles in which two people perished? We don't know which one perished first. Is therefore lo gazru be'Rabbanan. The Rabbanan had no compunctions and inhibitions about requiring chalitza. They can require chalitza. And we're not going to be afraid that if we allow chalitza, people mistakenly think that you could allow yibum as well, because the milslo shchicha lo gazru be'Rabbanan. That's the first answer of the Gemara. Now we get to the second answer. Inami. Another way that we could differentiate between Safek Gerushin and Safek Nafal of Abayis is Gerushin de Kaimi Erva. We have an Erva here in front of us, namely Rivka. Right? She's not dead. That's not like the case of Apolos, where she never died. Here she's alive. De Kamochach, and she proves that Sarah is a tzaras erva. V'tzarasa komatzich la chalitza. You're going to require chalitza for Sarah. Now, how could you require chalitza for Sarah when Sarah is in tzaras erva? There's a marriage relationship between Shimon and Rivka. Rivka's at Sarah, and with Shimon's death, Rivka together with Sarah fall for Yibum to Ruvain. Is Amri, what are the people going to think when they see that Sarah requires chalitza? They're going to come to the conclusion that Kimle Rabbanan Begita to Gita Malyahu. They must have checked out the situation, and they did a basic investigation, a thorough investigation. They came to the conclusion that when he threw the get fell karov low. I'm sorry. The get fell karov low. It came closer to her, and the get is therefore kosher. And therefore, if the get is kosher, Sarah is no longer a tzaras erva. She therefore falls for yibum, and now we understand why she requires chalitza v'yasili yibumei tzar. Now that they drew the conclusion that the chachamim must have investigated, and they came to the conclusion that the get is valid, it was karav law. Therefore, Sarah, is no longer tzaras erva. She falls for yibum to Reuven. They're going to allow Reuven to be the Yavima, because whenever they see chalitza, they think ipso facto that you're allowed to have yibum. However, mapoles, mi kamu be'Rabbanan mapoles. There's no way, no how that anyone in the face of the earth could come to the conclusion that the Chachamim did an investigation and they determined who died first between Shimon and Rivka. There's no way of knowing. It's not something that you can investigate and clarify. The two people died, and that's it. We found their bodies. So when the onlooker sees chalitza, he understands that this chalitza is a chalitza of suffix, and he's not going to allow yibum because yibum in a case of suffix certainly is not permitted. He might be violating an Isur Kares of Eishasat. So in the case of Gita, they think that the reason why you're requiring chalitza is because you validated the get. She's not a tzaras erva, but in the case of Mapolis, where no one could come to the conclusion that they knew that she is not a tzaras erva, they'll understand very well that the requirement of chalitza is a suffix requirement. There's no element of vadai. Only in the case of gerushin is there a possibility that they'll conclude it's a vadai get. So we're playing with fire if we require chalitza. That's the Shita Rabbah. Now the Gemara has to kash on Rabbah. The Gabi Gerushin Milotnan. We have a Mishnah in Masechet Gittin on Daf Ayin Ches, and the Mishnah says, Hoisa omedes b'shus harabim uzrako la. He throws a get in order to divorce her, and the law is karav lo law. If the get came closer to her, megureshes karav lo, eina megureshes mechzal mechza megureshes v'eina megureshes. What does that mean? Suffix megureshes. Bamrina and lamai hilchasa. When we consider her a megureshes, right? Because it says megureshes v'yeda megureshes. So what's the implication of megureshes? The ikohen who asurale. He could not remarry her because he's a Kohen and she's a Safek Grusha, and a Kohen can't marry a Grusha. Now we have another din, which is an afkamina by calling her Begureshes. Ve'i ervahi sarasa by chalitza. But if this woman that he's divorcing, we'll call her Rivka, was an erva to Reuven, who becomes the Yavam after the death of Shimon, and Shimon has another wife, we called her Sarah, then when Shimon dies, we're going to require chalitza in order to allow Sarah to get married. Why? Because on the tzad that the get was a valid get, which means that it was karov la, she, Sarah, is no longer a tzaras erva, and therefore she falls for yibum. She has a zikas yibum. We can't allow her to get married without chalitza. And this is against Rabbah, because Rabbah says in a Safek Gerushin, she had a chazaka of a tzaras erva, and if we don't know if the get was chal, we allow her to get married because of a cheskes hetel shuk, without requiring chalitza. The law, Amrinon, she'im ata omer choletzes misyabemes. The Mishnah indicates that we're not worried that somebody might come to the conclusion that in this suffix situation, the Rabbanan decided that the get was valid, and that's why they require chalitza, and therefore we could allow yibum. So the Gemara answers, Hayit Mar Allah, with regard to that Mishnah in Gittin, we have the following comment, which is Rabbah and Rav Yossi, they both agree that the Mishnah is not dealing with a case of Zrikas get, and we don't know where it fell, but rather we have what's called trey, two Edom against two Edom. Achas, one kat of two Edom, Omeres, Karav Lo. The Achas Omeres, Karav Lo. What do we do in such a case? The Havile Speaker Dorais. This is a gigantic debate about this issue. But we're going now according to one particular view, which is called Trey. Trey is a Speaker Dorais, meaning we get rid of all the chazakas. Clean the slate. It's pure suffix, trey utrey. And if it's trey utrey, then we have to require chalitza. No way, no how can we assume that the get was definitely karav law, and therefore she is a. Just 1 second, let me get the other way around. And she has a cheskes hetel shuk because she's what? She's a tsaras erva, right? So she doesn't need chalitza. There's no way that we can alleviate her requirement of chalitza and allow her to get married, because she might in fact be a Yevamot hamisya bemes, because the get was in fact karev law, and it was a valid get. So what are you going to tell me? But she has a cheskas hetel shuk. Not in this case, because it's trey is a fake doraisa, which means that there's one pair of Adam that completely destroys the chazaka. Umasnisa dahacha. And now our Mishnah, just 1 second, umasnisin dehacha, right? That according to Rabbah, she doesn't need a chalitza because we're afraid that people think that she falls for Yibum as well. And they're going to assume that the Chachamim made a determination that the get was certainly valid, and therefore Rivka is not married to Yaakov, to Shimon, and therefore Sarah is Misya Bemes. So that's the mistake they might make. Bekas achas. It means we're talking about a case where there was only one set of witnesses. Right? It's not a case of trey utrey. The havilei sfeika d'Rabbanan. So I'm going to read to you the commentary here that I have of the Masifta. He says, "Bekas achas shahayu shnei edim b'shas ma'isa hakedushin." So we're talking about a case where Shimon was makadesh Rivka the erva, and we don't know if the kedushin that he gave her was karav lo or karav la. And we split the kat into two, right? We have every kat of Adam is made up of two witnesses. So one witness says it was karav lo, and the other witness says it was karav la. So we don't have two witnesses to establish that the kedushin of Rivka's the erva, was in fact kedushin. So in that situation, when we have no valid proof to establish the validity of the kedushin, therefore the status of Sarah is that she is a zkuka liyibu. She's not a tsaras erva. She has a cheskas heter liyibu. We're not going to remove her chazaka based on one witness that says that Shimon's kedushin to Rivka, the erva, was karav la, and it was a valid kedushin. And havile speika the Rabbanan, because of this one aid, right? So again, let's go over this again. On a deraisa level, she certainly should have Yibum. We're going to worry about one aide who testified that it was karav la, and therefore the kedusha was valid, which makes Sarah into a tzaras erva. And therefore we're going to require chalitza. Right, so really, Mika Adin, she should be Mitzvah Bemetz, but we're going to be Machmir because it's fake Rabbanon, and we're going to think that maybe perhaps the Kedushin is valid, and therefore we're not going to allow Yibum. He writes here in the note, Lachein lo bira Mishnah, shesafek gerishin, hainu bofen shel safek karv lo safek karv k'mo shebiarnu legabi safek Kedushin, v'zeu mipnei shebesafek kazeh shel eid echad neged eid echad yesh la'amido min haTorah al cheskas hetel l'shuk, meaning that as far as we know, there was no gerushin to invalidate the status of Sarah as its Sarah's erva, so therefore she has a cheskes hetel l'shuk. V'lo echmiru rabbanan latzricha chalitza, because of the chashash to rabbanan that if we allow for chalitza, people will assume that the rabbanan knew that the get was a valid get, and therefore they're going to allow it to have yibum. So the Gemara asks, "Umimai demasnisin tohacha bekas achas." You're telling me that in a Safek Gerushin, she has a chazaka mikra adin, that she is a tzaras erva, and therefore we're not, in a case of kas achas, we're not going to establish that the get is a valid get. Maybe our Mishnah is also talking about a case of treyu trey, which is a sfeika doraisa, and therefore we have no choice but to require chalitza. So if that be the case, why didn't the Mishnah introduce Safek Gerushin as a scenario of Safek Karv Lo, Safek Karv La? And we require Chalitza not as a Chumrah, but Mikra Din, because she falls for Yibum, because there are two Edom that testify that the get was a valid get, and Sfeika Doraisa. So the Gemara answers that if we would interpret our Mishnah of Safek Gerushin in the case of Safek Karv La, Safek Karv La, and she needs Chalitza betray trey. Midoraisa Mikra Din. He says no. It's got to be Dumya the Kedusha. Right? You're creating a scenario in Safek Gerushin that's an exact parallel to Safek Kedusha. And in the case of Safek Kedushin, we said it was Bekas Achas. And if it was Bekas Achas, then we don't really, according to the Doraisa law, have a right to be Choshesh for Kedushin, and she has as a Cheskas Hetel Yibum. So therefore the whole issue of blocking Yibum is all a Chumrah D'Rabbanan. Is then Af Gerushin B'Vasachas. There should be an absolute symmetry. And Gerushin should also be a case of Basachas. But that's impossible because in a case of Safek Basachas, we're going to have to say, Uki Gavra Cheskasei, she has a chazaka of Muteris L'Shuk, meaning as a Tzaras Erva, without Chalitza. So the Gemara asks, the Kedushin Gufayu Mimai de Bekas Achas. And let's go over the logic, says the Gemara. Why did you exclude the possibility that the Safek in Kedushin was in a case where one aid says Karv La and the other says Karv Lo? Maybe one pair of Eidim say it was Karv La, another pair of Eidim say it was Karv Lo. And then we'll again raise the question, why didn't they say the same thing in Safek Gerushin, Safek Karv Lo, Safek Karv La? In two Kitei Eidim. And then, as we said before, we need Chalitza to be Mater Halach Shuk. And the Gemara answers, I B'shtei Kitei Eidim Tisyabein Ve'en B'kach Klum. Why, in a case of Safek Kedushin, do we block Yibum? If it's Trey, which is Sfeika Doraisa, we have no way of assuming that the Kiddushin of Shimon to Rivka was a valid Kiddushin in a way that we would now impose upon Sarah a brand new status of Sarah's Erva. No, we go back to original Chazaka in a case of Safek Doraisa, and Tisyabim Vein Bekach Klum. So the Gemara asks, what's your proof that what? That we're talking about Kas Achas, because if we're Shteki Te'edin, she would fall for Yibum. How could it be possible that in trade, we would allow Yibum, Kaime, Edim, Vikaamri, Karav La? There are two Edim that are testifying that when Shimon gave Kiddushin to Rivka, it was Karav La. There are two Edim saying so, which means that the Kiddushin is valid. And you're going to let Sarah, who now, according to those two Eidim, who are standing in front of us in Bezdin, she is a Tzaras Erva, you're going to allow it to be Misyabemes? V'yata Amris, and you have the chutzpah of saying, Tisyabim ve'emekach klum? When we have two Eidim that are testifying that the Kedusha was valid, it was Karav La, and therefore she, Sarah, is a Tzaras Erva. How could we possibly allow Yibum? Visu, and furthermore, you made a distinction between suffix of one kat and a suffix of trey, that a suffix of trey, even in the case of Gerushin, choletzes. Why choletzes? Because it's a suffix doraisa. And we're not going to say, well, let her fall for Yibum. Just 1 second. We're not going to say that let her marry someone else without chalitza and uki gabra b'cheskas hetel shuk, because until this gerushin she was a tzaras erva. No, we're not going to say that. We're going to require chalitza. So the Gemara asks, but b'shtei kitei edim namini sfeika d'rabbanani. Now the Gemara is picking up the other shita that trey is only a suffix d'rabbanan. On the deraisa level, we say uki gavra cheskoseh. Timid deraisa amrinon uki trey lebahadi trey ve'icha ukma chazaka. And the chazaka is that the erva, namely Rivka, was not nisgarsha, and that maintains the status of Sarah as a tzaras erva, and therefore she doesn't need chalitza. The Rabbanan were machmir not to rely on chazaka and to require chalitza. Now we get back to original kasha. Since we found that if nisgarsha erva b'safek gerushin, safek karav lo, is sarasa choletzes v'lo misyabemes. And what does that mean? That we're dealing with a Sveika D'Rabbanan, and Midoraisa we go back to the Chazaka, and her Chazaka is that she's a Tzaras Erva. We don't know that the get was Chal, and therefore she could not possibly fall for Yibum, but she requires Chalitza by virtue of this suffix, because maybe perhaps the get that was given by Shimon to Rivka was not a valid get. And therefore Sarah needs Chalitza. She's not a Tzaras Erva. Now I'm saying if it was not a valid get, then Sarah could not be Misyabemes and will require chalitza mitzad suffix. So why didn't the Mishnah give a case of suffix gerushin in a case of suffix karav lo? Suffix karav lo. So the Gemara answers no. I'm going to prove to you that in a suffix of trey, No. What the Gemara is now supporting the kasha, and in a case of trade, it's only a speaker derabbanan and midiraisa. We say uki gavra cheskasei midihavia nichsig debarshatya. So we have a certain person who sometimes was lucid and sometimes he was out to lunch, so to speak. He was a shoter. And Barshatya Zavnin Nichse, he sold his real estate. Lasu Beitrei, two Adam came Amri, and they testify Shu Cholim of it. He was absolutely lucid, and the sale is valid. Lasu Beitrei, another two pair of Adam came in Amru, Shu Shotas of it. He was deranged. He wasn't in a clear, normal mental state when he sold his karka, and therefore the Mechira's batel is a shota. Shota is not allowed barda. The Yomi Rav Ashi, uki trey le bahadi trey. We put the two Adam against the two Adam. And here on the top of Lamed Aleph on the base, the Ara ukva b'cheskes parshatya. We're not going to validate the Mechira because he is the cheskes marakama. He's the mocher. He has the cheskes marakama on this karka. If that be the case, then even in a suffix of trey, that we say uki cheskasai, so therefore we should be mamid the isha becheskasa, because we don't know that the get was a good get that Shimon gave to Rivka, and therefore Sarah's status is that of a Tzaras Erva, and therefore she's muteres l'shut. Why does she need chalitza? Apparently, the Rabbanan made exer that she required chalitza. And they're not afraid that if we require chalitza, somebody's going to be mata yibum. So therefore, even in the case of gerushin, in our Mishnah, we should have said the din of safek karav lo, choletzes. And what would be the reason, the logic to require chalitza in this case? Because we're going to assume the possibility that the get itself was valid, which means that Sarah is not a Tzaras Erva. And even though on a deraisa level we say uki gabrim cheskasei she had a chesok of hetel shuk and she doesn't require chalitza, the Rabbanim require chalitza, and we're not afraid that if we require chalitza, somebody will come to allow yibum. So at this point in the sugya, we have no answer to the original question. Why did the Mishnah, in the case of Safek Gerushin, speak about three psulim d'Rabbanan and get, and not introduce the same symmetrical mirror image of the ratio, namely Safek Karov Lo, Safek Karov Lo? And here's where we get to Abaye, and Abaye is going to just turn everything that we set upside down.